Good morning, everybody, and thank you for taking the time to join us for today's discussion titled Great Technology Trends Until They're Not. My name is Melissa Swan, and I'm the Marketing Director for Edafio Technology Partners. And I'm honored to introduce you to our presenters, Keith Woodruff and Mark Hodges. Keith joined Edafio over 10 years ago as President and CEO and has recently transitioned to his role as Chief Technology Officer. And many of you know him, and he has become a familiar face with the Elevate Forum. So he became Technology Officer and Managing Partner for Northwest Arkansas in 2020. Mark is the Edafio Vice President of Sales and Client Management, overseeing enterprise-wide business development and client relationship strategies. He leads a multidisciplinary team across the firm's growing client portfolio and geographical footprint. He brings 20 plus years of experience in sales and marketing and client relationship management to Edafio. He also is an adjunct professor of marketing and sales in the College of Business Administration at Harding University, where he has taught since 2003. Edafio Technology Partners, we are the largest Arkansas-based managed service provider, operating one of the most extensive groups of IT engineers and specialists in the region. We help build, support, and protect our clients' businesses through implementing and optimizing IT consulting, management, cloud computing solutions, cybersecurity, and healthcare consulting across multiple industries from our offices in Central and Northwest Arkansas. We are driven and owe our success to living by our core values, which begins with our commitment to our clients' success. So from here, I would like to go ahead and hand it off to Keith and Mark. And the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, welcome. And we titled this Great Tech Trends because we're going to cover a lot, but there's a parenthesis there, until they're not. So the intent is, while we want to introduce you to a lot of stuff here, we want to also give a warning that, some of it doesn't apply for your business perhaps. And therefore, we're just kind of calling some of that out as well. In 1980, IBM was the predominant player. They had just come out of an antitrust monopoly suit with the government. PCs were emerging, and they introduced a technology to allow personal computers to communicate with each other, and this idea of something called a local area network. And their technology for doing that was something called token ring. And it seemed like it had some really good advantages versus using twisted pair, which was already in the walls for telephones, for connecting computers. But guess what? That technology went bust. Even though it had some advantages and it was being pushed by the predominant player of technology, it went nowhere because the evolution of using twisted pair and making it shielded and thicker copper happened, and it just, now we have this thing called the Ethernet, and all of our local area networks use that instead of token ring. So there would have been a technology that if you invested in it, then it would not have been a good one. So we're going to show you some trending confusion around different technologies that you hear out in the marketplace, and we're not going to try to go into detail on any of these, but I'll touch on just a few of them. Certainly artificial intelligence is something that has emerged where machines are doing more complex computing and they're doing it extremely fast. There's this idea of almost boundless computing as a result of computers today. Edge computing is really a new buzzword for distributed computing, which says put the compute power out next to where the data is being collected. This is not a new idea. It was back in even the 60s and 70s, this thing called distributed computing. And people like Walmart, for example, would put computers in their stores to collect data and then process it in the store. Cybersecurity, we've talked about that. You've all heard about that and are aware of the issues and challenges there. That's going to continue. 5G ultra wideband is this high-speed capacity for cellular service. That is going to happen. It's going to, we believe, going to be in lots of devices and provide great bandwidth capacity to enable new types of applications. It'll probably be 2 to 3 years before we see broad deployment of that that delivers the kind of bandwidth that's kind of 10x what we have today. So all of that can be kind of confusing and can result in where do we go with that. So we're going to try to help illustrate how to pull that together and focus on the things that we think are important, I guess. One of the things here that I want to talk about is, in some ways, all these technologies are converging. The pandemic kind of set the stage for a new way for us to work, working remote and distributed. And there's tools like Teams, which we're using today, or Zoom, and that have been facilitated the communication. There's going to be more bandwidth capacity for all devices in the future that 5G was going to bring that will make that work better. We're now able to do this kind of work, or will be able to do it even more so as some of these technologies emerge. Cloud computing and software as a service is another one where basically if there's a particular application that is developed by that's really powerful, sometimes that provider of the application, instead of selling the software, they're going to sell you a service for that software. One of the things that we see emerging that we think is promising is this thing over there on the hyper collaboration is Microsoft Viva is just being introduced, and it takes a look at not only collaboration by using Teams or Zoom, but it also focuses on learning and bringing and onboarding new people, and that whole idea of how do we keep people educated and up to where productive in what they're doing by training. And then the third aspect of it is the well-being side, so that as we're distributed and the people side of our culture and things like that as a company are real important as well. And so Viva is Microsoft's attempt to try to provide this employee experience platform, or EXP is the three-letter acronym that's popped up with that. I want to now transition to kind of the next slide here, Mark, and let's talk about what does this technology look like, and what are some of the examples of what this boundless computing can do. Back in 2011, Watson competed against humans on Jeopardy, and Watson won. And this was kind of the first really high exposure artificial intelligence capability that many of us got to see and witness. And so what we're seeing is just this rapid growth of compute capability, and it's just almost like infinite, and it applies to all these other things: robotics, 3D printing, digital medicine, nanomaterials, and this idea of artificial intelligence, which in some ways Watson illustrated here with the Jeopardy. And now we're seeing Watson integrated into weather forecasting and other applications, data analytics. So the power of Watson, when they first used it, created it, that competed on Jeopardy, it had the capability to process 1 million books per second. So that was significant capacity and power, especially for that time. And it's only continued to get faster. So IBM migrated that whole capability that they used for Watson into the cloud. And now their cloud offering has this capability. Does Watson have application for businesses? Yeah, it's starting to get more and more, but it's not, I would say, commonly used for a lot of businesses. But over time, artificial intelligence from technologies like Watson will be more common and used by more of our businesses. Just to show a little bit of the growth of compute capacity, Moore's Law is something that's been around for about 60 years, and some people would say that it's no longer applicable, but the overall high level of it, I think, is still applicable. Moore's Law basically said that every 2 years, then technically it said the number of transistors on a microchip would double. And it was more of a kind of not so much a law, but what was happening at the time. And as a result, it became in some ways a self-fulfilling prophecy that said the compute capacity on a chip would, or the number of transistors on a chip would double every 2 years. What that's resulted in is an exponential growth of compute capacity and other aspects of technology, not just compute, but storage and in some ways bandwidth, as is illustrated by 5G. One way to look at this is to look at how many calculations per second can a $1,000 laptop computer process, and look at that over time. If we look back at the capacity associated with a mouse, you would see on the line there that would be 10 to the 11th compute cycles per second for a $1,000 computer. Well, so that happened in 2010, and then it's projected that a $1,000 computer would be able to do the compute power of the human brain by 2023. And if that curve continues, by the year 2050, a $1,000 computer would be able to have the same processing capacity as all the human brains in the world. So when you have exponential growth, there's crazy things that happen in capacities that are likely going to emerge. So this space isn't slowing down; it's just going faster and faster. And so Mark's going to talk a little bit about, so what do these trends mean? So Mark, let me turn it over to you.
Great. So thanks everyone for joining in. There are some words that came to my mind, and I will go ahead and admit, okay, it is probably a bit of a cause for concern when you get an engineer and a sales guy on a webinar together, that there will be a lot of words and a lot of salesy stuff. We're not doing that. This is purely educational, and one of the things that stands out to me in the trends that Keith walked through, and all of those, they're filled with buzzwords, they're filled with actual trends. It called my mind back to a phrase that I heard years ago, and it still resonates in my head, and that's the phrase, don't pick a fight with reality. There's this challenge that we have with trying to figure out how much of this is real, how much of it is not yet, and when it gets into our lives, what's the reality for what it's going to mean. So there are three words I want to introduce you to. You might even want to debate the merits of if one or two of them are even words, but I'm just going to use them regardless because they stand out to me as being a pretty good capture point of what these things actually mean to us when all of these trends start to converge, when all of this convergence starts happening. What does it mean? The first one that I'd introduce you to is the word called dematerialization. What in the world does that mean? Well, with all of the trends that are going on in technology, you've seen this. It's happened to you at your homes, at your businesses. Here is a visual for you. If you consider, and this is not me, okay, but if I wanted all this stuff back in the 80s and the 90s, but if you look at this picture, you have to be real honest and admit that 25 years later, all of this stuff fits into your pocket. That's the whole notion behind dematerialization. We're taking what used to require multiple pieces of gear, multiple pieces of equipment, a lot of different material, and it's crunched down to one thing, one device, and it creates a big challenge for us. In fact, it's changed the way, from a dematerialization standpoint, we even look at things like magazines. We rarely go to our mailbox to even pull a magazine out and read it anymore because it's in our pocket. We subscribe to services that give us access to thousands of magazines rather than having to sit and deal with individual subscriptions. So it has changed a lot of things from a dematerialization standpoint. The second word I would give you to think about as far as what the impacts of these trends are is demonetization. Now, that's a fancy word for saying that it really does redistribute a lot of things from the standpoint of the economy, but it also has created new economies. Here's an example. Look at all of these things on the screen. All of these things have been essentially replaced by the trends in tech. They've been replaced in a lot of different ways, and our habits have changed. We no longer, unless we just, we're going to be one of those folks that we like to smell the book, and we like to go and actually walk through Barnes and Noble, which occasionally I do. I call Barnes and Noble, for example, Amazon showroom, because that's where I go and scan the barcodes to see what I want to buy from Amazon. Uber has replaced taxi fleets, WhatsApp, or it could have been years ago Viber, or now Teams, or even Zoom. All of these things are replacing long distance. I remember when I had to pay in-state long distance for my wife to call my mother-in-law, and that got a little pricey early on in our marriage. And now it's not even a thing. I had to learn what the phrase intralata even meant so that I could understand why I was being charged so much. So you understand the concept, even though you may not be familiar with the word demonetization, but this is some of the trend that we see happening. And then one big one is democratization. I'll call it, if you want to put another word on this, I would call it mainstreaming. How a lot of these technologies actually start to mainstream themselves out and become very, very normal in society. Let me show you a couple of examples. There has been this explosion on the sensor side. This is the guy that created the original digital camera back in 1976. And it had a whopping 0.01 megapixels of resolution. It was just, I'm sure the pictures were beautiful. Nearly 4 pounds. The cost was $10,000. And incidentally, Steve Sasson worked for Kodak, but he was required to put it on a shelf because the Kodak executives realized it wouldn't help them sell more film. So, and we all know what's ended up happening to Kodak and their bankruptcy and everything else since then. Well, the first digital camera comes out, very costly, very low resolution. In 2019, the digital cameras going into your phones had greater than 10 megapixels. They weighed very, very little. They cost about $10 to put into your phone. We literally got a billion times better as far as resolution and as far as making it a lot more cost effective. It was democratized out into society, and very soon we're going to see more and more cameras in our phones with optics that rival insects that have hundreds of eyes. So we've gotten a billion times better on this front, and we're doing things a lot cheaper, a lot lighter, with a lot better resolution. We've seen it in other ways too. If you were around for the Apollo missions, which I will gladly say I came in on the tail end of, they had this instrument inside the capsule called the IMU, the Internal Measurement Unit. Cost millions of dollars to develop, weighed 50 pounds. It measured velocity, it measured orientation, it measured acceleration. And today, for about $4, it's in your phone in 2 chips. Everything that piece of equipment did. So everything continues to crunch down, get smaller, and become a lot more usable across society. And that's what's driving the development of molecular machines and having more and more free and embedded capabilities within those. But how about this? This would have looked cool on the back of our car, right? With that big pointy thing magnetized to the top of our car. The first commercial GPS receiver back in '81 cost nearly $120,000. And as of last year, the GPS receiver in your phone is a little less than $5. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about these trends that are demonetizing things. They're adjusting the economics of what we deal with. And you don't need me to tell you this, you felt it, right? Democratization, all of this flowing into our normal everyday lives. And then as far as all of the things from the standpoint of dematerialization, things that are causing different gadgets, that we would call them, to disappear. It used to be we would carry a mobile phone and a PDA in the early days, and now it's all combined together. So all of these things start to converge more and more. So with all of that said, let's just talk through some steps that might be helpful for you. Everyone loves talking about tech. I've noticed this over and over. Everyone loves talking about it. No one really wants to talk about responsibility around some of this, because in your business, and especially in your household as well, you may be overlooking some things. Everybody does. I've done it as well. Let's take security, for example. Last week, I drove through my neighborhood, and hacked is too strong a word. I didn't do anything nefarious. I just attached myself to 17 different neighbors' Wi-Fi because they had not changed the default admin password on their unit. It was easy enough to see, and honestly, they hadn't even changed the name of their unit. I was able to see Linksys 4327 or Netgear, whatever. And if they had changed it, it would have taken me a little longer to get in. But for now, I just know 17 of my neighbors, if I need to siphon internet, I can go do that because they just haven't hardened it up. Would you believe in our world, we see businesses who make a lot of the same mistakes. They leave very wide open holes in their networks that can create a big security problem. So we oftentimes carry our home behaviors into the workplace, and that can create a very difficult situation in your business. Second piece, behavior. You know, if you think about it, and you know this, we do things online we would never do in real life. We see all kinds of people, especially across social media, with all kinds of keyboard courage who would never have that same conversation in person. But I like to point out to people, if you get a link in your email, if that link were a doorway in a dark alley in New York City, you'd probably never walk down that alley nor even walk into that door. But for some reason, we click the link. We let our guard down. So there's a change of behavior from a responsibility standpoint that needs to start occurring with everyone, both personally and in their professional lives. And then from the standpoint of mindset, it'll never happen to me. That's usually when it happens, by the way, is when we start feeling it'll never happen to us. Telling ourselves, hey, we're secure. We've got antivirus running, so we're secure. A lot of times we are seeing in our world that convenience tends to win over security virtually every time. And we know that it's a hassle. I joked with Keith yesterday while we were putting some finishing touches on this. I remember the days when you could take someone to the airport and go to the gate with them. But now, unless you're a ticketed traveler, you aren't even getting near the gate. So, I mean, there are security things we need to do even in our technical lives to make our lives a little bit better. So let's walk through a few of those, because what we're living in is a world of what I call digital Darwinism, and it's a pretty common term. But when tech outpaces awareness, when the tech starts to evolve more rapidly than you're able to adapt, you're starting to be a victim of that. So let me take two simple examples. Cloud, for example. I can say cloud, and anyone listening to this in the future or on the call right now, we might have as many different definitions of cloud as there are people. because some people think, oh, you're talking about iCloud, or are you talking about cloud computing, or are you talking about cloud storage? What exactly is it? And the answer to all of those is yes, but it could easily be different slices of what we're talking about. And so what we found is that file sharing, remote computing, there's all kinds of convenience from the standpoint of a distributed workforce being able to utilize the benefits of cloud computing, which, by the way, I'll go ahead and give you a quick definition of cloud. It's 3 words: someone else's server. Okay, because that's really all cloud is. But we find all kinds of convenience with that. The lack of understanding around security and encryption, that becomes a challenge. And so we see more and more people put information out onto someone else's server in the clear, and it could create all kinds of challenges. Mobile is another one. We love our mobile devices. Access and interactivity, everything is at an all-time high. But as everybody on this call, have you hardened your accounts with your carrier to prevent a SIM card takeover issue? Because if that happens, you could end up spending literally months trying to fix that. And it's a quick fix to at least put a pin on your account. So little things like that, we can do some basic blocking and tackling and insulate ourselves from some of the rapid pace of what's going on. Here are a few more examples of things that might be helpful. Passwords, for me, they're so 2020. I would encourage you to forget passwords, try passphrases. Figure out a passphrase that works for you. Ideally, you would have a different password or passphrase for every instance where you need a password. And very few people want to do that. It is still terrifying how many individuals at companies we work with still try and use a form of the word password. Password and numbers, password and a date, using a form of their birth date and their password. Just some general things that you can do to try and make yourself and your companies more secure. One thing is use a password manager. I use one. I default and set it to a 100-character password, completely muddied up with special characters. And all I've got to do is remember my master password to that application, and it makes it a whole lot easier for me. And many of those password managers will also alert you if you have a username and password combination that have been breached or that have been posted on the dark web. So just, again, using biometrics, external keys, multi-factor authentication is something that we always recommend. It's really it should be a standard for everything in your business. It should be a standard. In fact, we're requiring all of our clients to use it. Even if they don't buy it from us, we don't care if they buy it from us or not. They just need to use multi-factor authentication. There are some great low cost or even free tools. Microsoft Authenticator has a really good option. Google Authenticator also has a good option. But just look at anything you do at your workplace and figure out, will it accept multi-factor authentication? If so, turn it on. In your personal life, if it can take multi-factor authentication, by all means, turn it on. Every social media account, turn on your multi-factor authentication. It will save you a world of problems. There's this whole notion that we've been kind of enamored with, which is the bad actors weaponizing convenience. We see it a lot where most individuals are so intent on technology making things more convenient for them that they won't take the steps to actually address where there could be issues. So just some examples for you that I would point out. Convenience does not always equal security. I will tell you, I really enjoy jumping into the new things and trying them. I guess my history in dealing with data and data operations has led me to I am that person who will read the end user license agreement. and find out where the data goes. Security is always going to be this balance of security versus your ability to use the system. I can make everybody's business very secure today by coming in and ripping out everything that plugs into the wall, but that doesn't help you. It doesn't help run your business. So we've got to find the balance. And part of what is important for you to think about, and for anyone in business today to think about, is how do we find the balance and be secure, but also get the benefit from the system? And then the question, does anyone really read the end user license agreement? You probably should. Here are a couple of examples. These are the big things right now. Let's take Snapchat. The time machine filter, that's a big one, and everybody's getting a lot of kicks out of that. Take a picture of yourself and you can age yourself forward or backward and see if it gets it right. And we may not even like the aging features of that one. And then on Instagram, how old do I look filter? I don't need Instagram to tell me I look old, but some people want to play the game. How old do I look? The reason I'm even putting these up is because you might recall 2 years ago, Instagram had a filter out that would basically age you to the point of being a geriatric. And it would take your picture, it would age you. Everybody got a big laugh. I remember at the time I was working in New York, people were running around the office trying to snap pictures of everyone else and get old people pictures. I think they were trying to create like what we would all look like if we were in the nursing home together board. But then before I put it on my phone, I started looking and I read the end user license agreement, and slowly, shortly after that, it started coming out. I didn't put it on there because all of the data from that application was being sent to a database in Russia. And it turns out it was being sent to a company in Russia that actually developed facial recognition software. So they were capturing faces that goes to someone who holds the keys to the kingdom of facial recognition. And we just might want to be a little bit more careful about that. But what's the natural tendency? I mean, let's face it, I teach college students every week. They are not reading the end user license agreement. They're scrolling to the bottom as fast as they can and clicking accept. So just something to be aware of. Pay attention to anything that you're going to use that will capture data. Whether it's data about your business, or even now we need to be more careful about data about our appearance and data about our biometrics. So pay attention to those things. And here's the last piece we'll hit, and then we will pause and have any discussion or questions that might come up. Just the idea of our lack of awareness can lead to some self-destructive behavior in the middle of the trends that we're dealing with. So we encourage everybody, enjoy the new trends, decipher them, understand them. Don't just race into them, but figure out you can still get into them early as long as you take just a little bit of time to understand about them. Here are 6 things that we're recommending to a lot of folks. I'll just share them with you. Security awareness. Just pay attention. This is not just digital security, it's also physical security. We saw with what became known as the Stuxnet virus, which was, I believe, actually originally called Olympic Games. It was one of the first viruses that was seen out in the wild that could actually cause physical harm to devices. In that case, it looked like it was geared toward causing harm to centrifuges in Iran. But if you think about it, a virus that can get into a control unit and cause something to run at a higher RPM than it should, or maybe even get into your stovetop and cause it to run hotter than it's supposed to, or get into your refrigerator, because all of our appliances are starting to be Wi-Fi enabled, and cause it to not shut off the water once the ice tray is full. Any of these things can actually cause a little bit of challenge for you. Avoid email triage. We see people get into trouble all the time because they're overwhelmed at their business email. We spend all day going through it. For me, email is like cleaning my garage. I've been cleaning my garage for 20 years. I'm still not done. And I feel like I go in and I clean out my inbox only to have to start the whole process over again in the afternoon. You feel it too. Anybody in business does. The challenge is, how do you spend enough time trying to see if that message is even real? So the quickest thing you could do is just ask yourself, is there a reason I should expect this message? It looks like it's from someone internally. It's got an attachment on it. Should I really open this? There are a lot of great tools out there that can teach you a lot of really good email habits to pay attention to. But we see over and over and over again, somebody opens an attachment, they click a link, and it just causes all kinds of problems, whether it is ransomware or even actually just figuring out who else is in their system. And before you know it, your admin has gone out and bought gift cards that they thought you had told them to go buy. Don't think your business is too small. And I've talked with multiple clients that say, oh, nobody's interested in us, we're too small. Well, actually, smaller businesses are exactly who everyone is interested in these days. It's a lot easier to get into smaller businesses than it is into a Walmart or into a Procter & Gamble or someone like that. So pay attention. It is worth investing in the time and effort for security for your business. Closing the front door is something we tell people all the time, which is just trying to make sure that your employees are aware, here's some good habits you need to get into from the standpoint of email. And ask yourself, do you want to allow employees to access social media networks in your office? I'm not trying to tell you to be an ogre. I'm just trying to tell you, you need to pay attention to what kind of traffic goes across your system. We literally found 2 months ago a client of ours who had a printer communicating with China. Talk about random, but we don't know what it sent, and we don't know what it received, but somehow something got onto that network that caused that printer to open up a connection and just shield it. And it can cause problems long before you're aware of it. To do that, we recommend whether you insource or outsource your technology, this is just my plea. Make sure your IT budget is a primary part of your budget. In virtually almost every case where we see problems, that entity has made IT a residual budget item. They create their budget, and whatever's left, we'll give a piece to IT. We'll buy 3 more laptops next year. That doesn't help you from the standpoint of being able to plan for security and plan for trends that might even help your business. And then the last piece here, make sure in your organization the right people are in charge of the technology. That is something that we see happen too often, where the wrong person is in charge, and it's not because they're bad people, it's because they just aren't familiar with it. Or maybe they're enamored by it, but they're not trained in it. We see a lot of shade tree IT folks out there who can make things work, but leave things porous. And so we really recommend you put the right people in charge, whether that's internal or external, that's up to you. But we really encourage people to try and put the right people in charge of your tech. So all of that, we've raced along for 45 minutes here, and I know that we have probably an hour scheduled, but we don't want to, we want to respect everyone's time. So I'll take this off the screen and hand it back. Keith, if you have any other comments you'd like to share, otherwise we can take any questions if there aren't.
Mark, you mentioned the usage of password managers. Are there a few that, which one do you use, and what are a few that we should be considering?
Yeah, so if you're familiar with them, there's several really good ones out there. 2 of the names you'll hear the most, and incidentally, this is something that it's probably best purchased from a personal standpoint through, if you're on iPhone, go through the App Store. If you're on Android, go through Google Play. 2 of the bigger ones, one is called 1Password, just the numeral 1 password. Another one is Dashlane. There are several out there. Those are 2 of the ones that are consistently rated very, very good. And there is, even if you don't want to invest, and when I say invest, we're talking maybe $20 a year. I mean, they're not outrageously priced. But if you don't want to go that route first, many of you have probably already been using a form of this, whether it's Google storing your passwords, if you use Chrome, or if you see a request, and you may not have thought of it this way, but there's this thing within Apple products called iCloud Keychain. And that will also store your passwords for reuse. And both of those, Google and iCloud, now offer a strong password option. It will suggest strong passwords. For me, I use one of the ones you subscribe to, just because I can also integrate that with a physical key. I occasionally will use a biometric USB key for certain instances to do a second factor of authentication.
So Keith, Mark, Melissa, Joe Thompson here. Thank you for at least giving me a framework. Just for background, I run the Arkansas Center for Health Improvement. I guess a question, I'm always challenged by the promise of what people talk about and the reality of where we are. Do you have any guidance of kind of how somebody who's got a lot of responsibility but not much knowledge can gauge what's real versus not?
Yeah, I've got an opinion, but I'll share that with you. And I'm going to refer you to a book that might be helpful. It's an older book, but it's a book called Crossing the Chasm by a guy named Jeffrey Moore, Jeffrey with a G. And he first took, I'm sure most everyone's familiar with the product adoption life cycle. He actually turned that into a technology adoption life cycle. And in that book, he talks about this chasm that goes from the early adopter phase. So you've got the innovators, which are the people who would pay $10,000 for a flat screen TV in the 90s, to the early adopters, which are the people who will try it pretty early. And then there's this chasm between them and the early majority. And the way you jump through that is through references. That's where you first start getting into the pragmatic buyers. What I would suggest is, you're right, there's always promise, but there are always caveats, it seems like. People promise the world, and then you start racing toward that tech, and before you know it, there are 50 different things that you have to have in place just right to make it work that way. So what I would recommend is, especially in your case, you can be in the early majority, but you're going to want to have references from some people who are actually using it. In your case, I would highly recommend that. Be a little pragmatic on that. You don't have to be late majority, but you can be early majority. You're probably not going to want to jump in super early on some things. It can be relatively early, but I would recommend, if you don't already have one, build up a peer base of individuals who you can bounce some of these things off of, and they can be your own references. And then whoever's trying to sell you something can give you their references as well. But I really recommend doing that. Odds are you're going to find with one or two of those things in the first 2 years of life, you'll find some folks that'll say, yeah, once it's actually fully installed, it'll be great. But we've been trying to install it for a year and a half. That's your pause button, I would say. That's your yellow light. I don't know if that helps at all, but I think that book gives a really good pragmatic way to look at when should you adopt certain types of tech.
Great, thank you. Is there ever a safe time? You mentioned cloud, is storing on somebody else's server. Is there any safe time to actually put very, very sensitive data on the cloud?
There is, but I'd be careful about it. I think what we see is an evolution of people keeping the crown jewels of data close by. And so before they put it out into a cloud, or at least they are being very careful about which cloud they put it in and how it's secured. One of the technologies that I failed to mention, Dr. Thompson, is this a technology for security called zero trust. And what zero trust does is differentiates from how traditionally, you've built firewalls around your data or your infrastructure, kind of like a moat around a castle. But once you got across the moat, you could do anything inside there. And that's a problem because the moats could be breached or the firewalls can sometimes be breached. So this zero trust model, which has been around a little bit, but it's not seen and applied yet in many cases, says, okay, once you're inside the infrastructure, we're going to check you and make sure you're who you say you are before you do anything. In other words, we have zero trust of who you are, and we're going to try to authenticate you every time you do something. And that's a model that I think we're going to have to go to with this whole security space, and we're not there yet. But that's a direction. So I would say until you're fully comfortable and fully confident that your very HIPAA protected confidential data is in a cloud that you have a high degree of confidence in and references to, like Mark mentioned earlier, then you may want to hold on to it for a little bit longer and see and find out what some of your peers are doing.
Okay.
UAMS, I don't know if do they use a cloud today or not? I don't know. But I think that's a really good question. And we have clients who deal with that. And some of them choose to put it out there. And some say, okay, these are our crown jewels of data. We can't, if our business loses control of this data, the impact is huge. Mm-hmm. So they choose not to. Okay. But at the same time, if you don't handle it internally right, you're putting yourself at the same risk. So does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yeah. I would say if there's no other questions, we'll call it a wrap. Thank you guys for joining us, and hope we've provided some value. Meeting adjourned. Take care.